Can we have, oh yes, wonderful. Can we please come in and continue? We are a bit late.
So the next step here is that we also have an intergenerational approach. There are some older people like Stefan, some middle age like me, and there's the next generation who has to suffer under the bad things we did after the last 100 years. So I'd like to introduce a friend of mine from Schumacher College. We met a year and a half ago around at the college in Totnes, and he mailed his research to us, and we were just fascinated by the enormous things that are going on in scientific ways, but also in real life. And he devoted part of his studies to this topic, why we gather here together, and will share some of these insights during the next 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And there's also a group then which you can join. Thank you and welcome to the first time in your life to Portugal.
Hello. Everyone hears me? Can everyone hear me? Great. Yeah, just first, before I start, I'm really, really grateful to be here. So thanks to Stefan and thanks to everyone who's here to make this possible. It's amazing to be in the presence of a lot of amazing people doing their own work to help us move forward. So also it's been a really beautiful few days in Idania to visit some projects around and see the character of this place, and it really feels like there's something bubbling here, which I'm very excited to be part of. Am I speaking too fast? All right? Okay. So I'm going to be speaking today about access to land, about land rights and how they're pretty central to how we can really move forward back to a rural economy, back to a thriving rural life. But yeah, before that, a little bit about me. So you might know the picture from the... so I was born in Manchester in an urban setting. I grew up as an urban person, and then only in the past few years, I've been searching for something more meaningful. And that led me to Schumacher College in Devon, which is in Totnes, where Rob Hopkins also lives. And there's a lot happening in that region with revival of rural life, with community, and I was really honored to be there and for a year. And I was doing my master's there, and I spent the summer researching what's happening in that part of the world that, with reference to land rights. How are people getting hold of land? How are people working with governments to make change? So that's basically the topic. Just to give a small outline, I'll begin by talking about what is the dominant story that we're facing today, and how that's grounded in historical issues, and the present contemporary issues. I'll then move on to the new story. What do we want? What are we moving towards? And then I'll outline my research and give some insights, hopefully, and about how we can move forward. And I'm aware my research was based in England and in the UK, and some things won't be as relevant, but I hope you can take something from the next 30 minutes or so. So, before I really begin, I just want to say, this isn't the truth, This is just my experience of the world. And I don't want to claim that I know the ultimate truth. You know, I have a few stories to tell and a few experiences, so if you come here expecting to find out the answer to the problems, maybe I don't have them, but I hope it can be helpful. So, how am I entering into this discussion, really? Like, the framework through which I'm seeing it is that the world is made up of stories. And as the great politico-economic commentator George Monbiot says, it's those who tell the stories that run the world. And today the dominant story is of rural depletion. It's of a removal of autonomy for most people on the planet. It's away from communion and relationship with nature towards dependency on the global economy. Farming is an industry rather than a culture. Food production is unsustainable. Nature is a commodity to be exploited, and most people should live in the cities. It's really important to understand that this dominant story is not possible. Like, we cannot continue surviving with this story. So we need a new story. And these new stories are already being told. Alternative ways of living are already occurring all over the place. They're reconnected to nature, they're grounded in an ecological way of living, and they're constantly emerging and evolving, as Rob Hopkins gave a few examples earlier. These examples are beacons for others to follow. Nothing happens in isolation, and they can really help us rebuild rural life in a convivial way. So, the dominant story is grounded deeply in historical events. One of the most important events that happened in England was in the 18th and 19th centuries. A series of parliamentary acts known as the enclosures essentially turned common land where people could farm a subsistence livelihood into privately owned enclosed land. And that essentially brought about agrarian capitalism. And we're talking about 7 million acres of land, which is a sixth of the whole of England, was turned from common land into private land within 100 years. The most devastating shift that came from that was that by 1850, 75 to 80% of land was now owned privately by landlords. The farmers would rent this from the landlords, and the agricultural labourers were employed as wage labourers on the land. The idea of a peasant in England didn't exist by 1850. In fact, the word was often used to mean agricultural labourer. So we're talking about a complete disconnection from the possibility of peasant livelihood. In fact, by 1850, the peasants were an unimportant minority, and only 20% of the population was working on the land. And it's really important to understand that this story came at a similar time to the rise of classical economists. It's the same logic that we have today with free market economics. That logic means improvement and progress can only occur through division of labor, through mass production, and through the exploitation of capital. This is the same logic which we see today which we've seen historically through colonization, through the subjugation of people around the world, and today through the development model in which many people are forced into a global economy they don't want to be part of. Of course, we must understand that the situation in the 18th and 19th centuries was different around the world and in Europe. And it's shown quite clearly when you contrast what was happening in France at the time to what was happening in England. In France, there was a revolution which led to land reform, and in England, there was enclosures which led to people thrown off the land. It was an exact and opposite thing. So there are differences, and I'm very aware of that. In fact, only in the past 50 years have we've seen the same levels of rural depletion in southern Europe as we have in England 150 years ago. But today, the issues that we've experienced are still reverberating across the European landscape. There's been an exponential rise in the concentration of land. In fact, now only 3% of farms own 52% of farmland across the whole of Europe. Land is a commodity. We're increasingly shifting from land is increasingly shifting from the primary basis of subsistence for small-scale farmers towards the object of speculation for investors. And this doesn't only threaten people from being thrown off the land, it threatens to destroy rural communities altogether. It destroys food quality, and it prevents ecological resilience in farming. And being part of the European Union means we're part of the Common Agricultural Policy, which continues to replicate the same story. It rewards people based on hectare ownership. And obviously now a lot of places in Europe, a lot of farming in Europe depends on these subsidies, but a completely different system would support small-scale agriculture, because in some parts of Europe, if you have a farm under 5 hectares, you don't receive any funding, so you're already starting from a different place. In fact, these are all examples of institutionalized or systemic preventatives of the survival of rural life in Europe. So we need a rural renaissance. And that's what we're all here to discuss today. How can we rebuild rural life? In fact, the great agrarian writer Colin Tudge puts it very well. We need an agrarian renaissance, applying the principles of agroecology, food sovereignty, and economic democracy to establish enlightened agriculture as the global norm. And he says, the renaissance must be led by us, the people at large. He's calling for a completely new system altogether, an agriculture that treats farms as ecosystems, a food system that provides sovereignty and control, and then principled economic democracy to help us transition there. But we also need to understand, what do we mean by rural? What is this rural we're trying to create? Because often rural issues, or the idea of rural spaces, has completely conflicting values and conflicting imagery. It can be seen as the signifier of national identity, a counterpoint to modernity, wilderness, backwards, underdeveloped, in need of modernization, just a contrast to the urban, the industrial capitalist space. But it also can be referred to as a radical space, which is grounded in communism and anarchism, which is reactive to the capitalist productive system. It's a space for green politics and action. It's a space for counterculture and low-impact living, back to the land migration, permaculture, place-based practices, new education, craft revival, community and localization. In the end, we must see our rural spaces as inherently land-based. Simon Fairley says it very well. The rural economy, if the term has any meaning at all, has its foundation in the land and what the land produces. Animal, vegetable, and mineral. A rural culture is distinctive because it grows out of the land. Rural culture is rooted in the earth. That doesn't mean to say that we can't have other things happening that aren't based on food production, but the basis for rural cultures must be rooted in the land. So a new ruralism means a new agriculture, and there's many different writers and agrarian and different models of agriculture which are aligned to this. And yesterday some of us heard a really very clear representation of biodynamic farming, and it's rooted in a much deeper understanding of the relationship between humans and the land. But there's 2 great writers who I think I want to bring into the room who say it better than most people. And one of those is Wendell Berry, who's a farmer in Kentucky, and he writes a lot about the importance of homesteading and the failures of modern agriculture in political, spiritual, and economic terms. He talks about the problem with industrial agriculture being that they're missing one of the most important ingredients, which he calls husbandry. He explains that to husband is to use with care, to keep, to save, to make last, to conserve. Husbandry is the name of all practices that sustain life by connecting us conservingly to our places in the world. It is the art of keeping tied all the strands in the living network that sustains us. And so it appears that most and perhaps all of industrial agriculture's failures are the result of an attempt to make the land produce without husbandry. The other important figure that I want to bring to the room is Masanobu Fukuoka, who was a Japanese back-to-the-lander, and he inspired a huge movement of people back to the land in the 1970s in Japan. For him, farming provided a kind of freedom that is sacred, one which allowed the farmer to spend the winter months hunting rabbits and writing poems and composing songs. Now, of course, he's talking about how agriculture was once, and how agriculture gave a certain freedom. He explains that the ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. If government policy reflected that idea, I'm sure we'd have a very different system today. Uh, so that was just an introduction to kind of see where I'm coming from and where I went into my research. So basically, I spent the summer researching in England, going around the southwest of England speaking to people who've gone back to the land, small-scale farmers, people who are campaigning at a local government level to help people onto the land, cooperatives that had formed in order to provide access to land at a more affordable level. I visited smallholders. Here is a smallholder from London he essentially moved back to the land about 20 years ago and now runs a market garden. I met a smallholder who had attained some land through a cooperative and was now running a herbal medicine practice, growing all of the crops herself and food for subsistence. I visited communities who were living together, making their subsistence through the land. My research basically tried to ask, how can we move from the current situation, the dominant story, towards the new desired situation? What will it take? And I'll go through a little bit of what I found, but obviously I don't have time to explain everything, but I will leave my email at the end of the presentation and you can get in touch and I'll happily send you my research. So, okay, that's not me. Oh, something's happening up there. Any idea? Okay, it seems better. Is everyone following, by the way? Am I going too fast? Let me know. So, yeah, just to start, some of the main things I found, or I tried to find out, was what was preventing people from getting onto the land. Because it seemed that there's many people who were interested in finding land, but were unable to start a land-based livelihood because they couldn't get hold of land. And firstly, they were priced out. Because people who really wanted to work on the land, they can't afford to buy or rent it. Housing in rural areas has become unaffordable for people earning an income from farming. The countryside has become the place for the wealthy. It's a place to keep your ponies. It's a place to build large houses. In fact, in the UK, during the recession, the value of land went up more than gold. It's become a place of investment for foreign investors. And speculation also increases the price of land. Once the planning authority authorizes land as a development, then it's suddenly worth 10 to 100 times the value. Secondly, finance. Even if people could find a bit of land that was available, they were unable to afford to buy it. Finance is rarely available for the kind of small-scale agriculture that we're talking about. In fact, many people who had a route onto the land already had enough income to go there. So these are huge systemic issues. I'm not sure how the planning system works in Portugal, but in the UK, it's not designed for rural revival in the slightest. The planning system was created in 1947, and the idea was to have the countryside as reserved for agriculture, and people should live in the cities to be easily serviced. There was also quite a well-reasoned conservationist approach to protect agriculture and to protect the countryside from being overdeveloped. But this was a blanket policy and a blanket idea, which essentially prevented many people from being able to move to a land-based livelihood. The issue really is that the planning system doesn't understand the possibilities for a connection to the land, a human relationship with the land, which is ecological. It sees humans being on the land as a bad thing. So there were many preventatives stopping people from getting on the land. But of course, some people managed to find ways to get through those. And these successes happened at community level, happened at local government level, and at national level. I'll give a few examples of what I found. So Lammas is an eco-village in South Wales, and they were able to get onto the land essentially through a very good activist campaign and a partnership with the local government. Essentially, the local government said, we agree people should be able to live on the land. There's a way to people to live a low-impact life on the land, and therefore they developed a policy which allowed people to live on the land with the amount of land which is, let me just reset. Allow people to live on the land with 1.88 hectares per person, which is the amount of land that everyone could have if we were all to share it equally. So that was the idea. But the important thing is that once a mayor understands that this works and this is possible, soon enough, many people have an opportunity. The Ecological Land Cooperative was formed around 10 years ago, and essentially they noticed that there were people who couldn't afford to get on the land, so they decided to form a cooperative. And the way it works is that they raise funds through a share launch, they buy the land, and they rent it or sell it to smallholders at a reduced rate. But the other important thing is that they provide assistance to the smallholders in getting planning permission. So that removes the smallholder from a fight against the government or from a fight against the unequal market to being able to more of a solidarity, a community way of helping people get access to land. And it leaves the farmer to be able to do what they do best, what they want to do, which is work the land, rather than fighting against a government to be able to build your home there. But they were quite limited in the UK. And actually, I recently found out that there's a similar model in France called Terre de Lion, and they've managed to get hold of 130 farms, whereas in the UK, they now have 3 sites and only 9 farms altogether. But it's a slow process, and and when you're fighting against a huge system, it's very hard. In Scotland, it's a completely different story to the rest of the UK. And this is largely part of a deeper historical issue in the fact that peasant farming, which is in a way known as crofting in Scotland, is still the norm, and there's still 18,000 crofts across Scotland, and essentially that's created a completely different culture. But the important thing is that there's been huge amounts of land reform in Scotland in the past 20 years, and that was only possible when Scotland was given powers to have their own parliament and make decisions for themselves. So once they were able to do that, the culture that was surrounding land-based livelihoods was able to influence greatly. And most famously, the Isle of Egg, which is a small island in Scotland, the community was able to buy out the whole island themselves. And now, because of the success of that model, the Scottish government are providing funding to help more people to buy out their own land. But to truly rebuild rural life, we need a lot more of these initiatives. We need a mass movement which ties together the work that everyone's doing. There needs to be a wider movement for land reform and land rights if change is going to happen on a larger scale. So there needs to be a coherent philosophy which ties together the arguments for rural renaissance and the need for a land rights movement in reaching that. We need to stop teaching these things in isolation. Farming, science, economics, and moral philosophy should be drawn together. They should be contextualized within the same space. We need a stronger educational campaign to inform the public about these issues. The more people that hear about them, the more it becomes a mainstream issue. We also really need to draw together the separate movements, because there's a lot of things happening, but there isn't this coherent unity. So a movement which stretches above and beyond those visibly affected by land inequality is vital. But we also must reinvigorate political discussion in a rural setting. But at the end of the day, this is clearly a systemic issue. The fight for land rights is an irreducibly political struggle. In fact, a new rural economy requires a critique of the current neoliberal capitalist system of governance and ownership of land. The current situation is that the market rules, and decisions regarding how land is used are determined by those in power, which is in turn determined by those who own the land. Leaving things to the market will always gravitate to commodification and inequality. So what options do we have? Governments can nationalize land and then redistribute it fairly. With land in public hands, there's a possibility for democratic control of decisions made, and a strong campaign for land will be more worthwhile. Public ownership of land should, in theory, remove land from the market in perpetuity and socialize rents in the process. But of course, waiting around for national governments has already left us in this mess. So the most imminent thing we can do is to empower ourselves from the grassroots. Land should be owned by communities for the common good. The government should enable an ecosystem that empowers communities to be in control of the land that they actually use. They can put infrastructure in place for local communities to own land and govern it themselves. Communities have the power to reclaim little bits of land today, and they can change the system from the ground up. And people are already doing that. They're building projects and they're getting access to land. Community action is commendable and essential, but admittedly, it's limited in the amount that it can change at the speed we need it to change. In fact, the transition time movement is community-led, but the example of Ungersheim that was given by Rob shows that when a mayor understands what needs to be done, things happen so quickly. So the way forward may not be as radical, but rather it might be to embrace a progressive partnership, to fill the space between the successful grassroots movements and the willingness for change in the institutions. It's not accepting that we're all powerless, it's operating power through the institutions of public sector that we have. And we've seen success in Wales, the example I gave earlier. We've seen success here. The mayor understands what needs to happen, and things are starting to move forward. So I was recently in the Ardèche in France. It was fig season, so I was eating lots of figs from the trees. It was beautiful. And what I found similar stories there. Yes, there is one dominant story, and that story is that towns and villages have been deserted. After the war, a lot of women were left on the land and were unable to look after the land and families themselves, and this story was common. I heard it through many people. But the people who were telling me these stories were young people who'd moved back to that land. In fact, I spoke to many people who'd moved back to the land that had been deserted by their own families 50, 60 years ago. I met peasants who were still living entirely subsistence lifestyles. I met shepherds who were living through producing goat's cheese, taking the goats out to feed on acorns. I met communities living in ecological lifestyles, generating their own power, building schools with different pedagogies. And the area was completely teeming with young people who were looking to escape cities and build a more slow, simple pace of life. And in the Ardèche, I witnessed the same stories, the same issues that I've been researching over the summer. And it's the same here, that people are resisting, and people are building partnerships. People are working together to get things done. And it's really inspiring. So, some conclusions. Well, first I'll recap what I've said because I've gone quite fast and I think I got lost myself as well. But we sit in the midst of a crisis, in the precipice between two stories. It's essential that we move above and beyond the status quo. And the status quo is a story deeply rooted in history, in ancient economic ideas of progress. We must abandon the dominant story, the idea that rural areas are merely for industrial production of food must be challenged. And the story of the new rural economy is already being dreamed. Its essence is a rural economy that has foundations in the land and by what the land can produce. It creates a deeply rooted culture and livelihood that is determined by the land. This means a human-scale agriculture that's inherently ecological and a husbandry of the land. It also means being integrated into the landscape, creating ecological lifestyles through direct relationships with the land. Now, how can we get there? How can we move from the dominant story to the new story? Resistance exists throughout society. New relationships between communities and land are possible, and we must reach out to these initiatives and feed their growth, even if it means working with the institutions that already hold power. In fact, none of these successes happen in isolation. They all inform the wider public on the art of the possible. They become beacons for others to learn from and follow. One ecological land cooperative can never be enough to rebuild land-based societies. One public social partnership can never be enough to rebuild land-based societies. And even one national government policy can never be enough. None of these things alone are sufficient, but all are necessary. And even deeper than that, these movements, happening in tangent, like a confluence of rivers meeting, can maybe gather enough momentum to push through the neoliberal capitalist dam and eventually change the system. The revolution, if there's ever going to be one, will not be one of mass-scale, violent overthrowing of the oppressor. It will be a slow and laborious process of individual communities getting hold of land wherever they can, working with institutions when the opportunity arises, and at the same time continuing to fight at the higher levels for larger-scale reform. I must reiterate that it seems the critical opportunity for fundamental change is the space between the grassroots movement and the institutional willingness. And this is where a lot of our energies must be focused. But I'd like to end with a little hopeful note. Throughout my research and throughout the past few months in which I've been traveling around and seeing what's happening in rural areas, I've been so inspired to see people who are moving onto the land at the same time as engaging at the wider political level to help rebuild rural life. So yes, we might not feel optimistic, but we can't give up hope. Thanks.
Thank you, Samson. It was very good, and we are really in time. This is fantastic. I think we have, or you have shown us, in my point of view, 3 different collaborations which are important. The first one is that we ourselves collaborate. The second is, I think, the local municipality is a very important factor if you want to change the countryside. So we have to collaborate. It's very important to collaborate with the municipalities in this world, because they are the closest political institution to us. Yeah, all others are far away, and they don't understand very often what is the need. So we have to use municipalities to work closely with them. And the third one is to learn to collaborate across borders. So to link municipalities, to link our actions, our news stories with other news stories around this world. So that is the next step, which we hopefully moving on in the next sessions after our lunch. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I would be wish that you're coming at 3 o'clock punctual, because we have Rob Hopkins, and again we will be delivered the questions which Johannes collected, and then he will talk about these questions what you had and give hopefully some interesting answers. Thank you.